A once close-knit group, the Beatles were beginning to pull apart as they neared their last curtain call. There was a lot of friction during the production of the White Album in 1968. In fact, Ringo Starr briefly left the band. The Let It Be meetings, formerly called the Get Back sessions, continued the next year with the same level of disagreement. Feeling overwhelmed by his responsibilities within the band and the intense atmosphere, George Harrison, too, took a short break. John Lennon's admission that he wanted out of the legendary Four during a September 20th, 1969, band meeting was akin to filing for a divorce and marked the beginning of the Beatles' demise. After this news came out, Paul McCartney went into hiding to work on his first solo record. The audience was informed of the Beatles' breakup with its publication in 1970. In April 1970, Paul announced his resignation from the band in a press statement that was released alongside this album. As reported by the Liverpool Echo, the final Beatles album, Let It Be, was out in May 1970, containing music recorded from February 1968 through April 1970, despite the formal separation. This only served to escalate the arguments among Paul, John, Ringo, and George. The group's financial woes and the future of their music were further exacerbated by a heated dispute that raged throughout 1969 over Alan Klein's appointment as manager. The anticipated May release of Let It Be and Paul's McCartney were already causing friction within the band, but the timing of their respective releases only made matters worse. In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced his departure from the Beatles and released his solo album, McCartney. He had already told his bandmates of his intentions. However, Ringo Starr personally pleaded with Paul at his home on behalf of John Lennon, George Harrison, and Apple in an effort to postpone Paul's release date. This was in response to Apple's desire to prevent a release clash and Paul's unwillingness to communicate with Apple because of his disapproval of their manager, Alan Klein. Paul refused to budge and demanded that Ringo vacate his residence. Following the dissolution of the Beatles, their friendship remained icy. Paul petitioned the High Court to dissolve the Beatles' commercial partnership in December 1970, following the release of Let It Be and McCartney. In March 1971, the court granted Paul's request. John and Paul's relationship had deteriorated by the time they were leaving the Beatles. John had spoken out against Paul's work in the late 60s, particularly the groundbreaking 1967 record, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which Paul had largely inspired. The music they made together while they were both independent artists was a reflection of their broken relationship. With the single Too Many People included on his 1971 solo album, Ram, Paul finally broke through to the public. In an interview that followed, Paul said that this song included a covert jab at John. "I recall there was one tiny little reference to John in the whole thing," he remarked in an interview with Playboy from 1984, reflecting on the song's subsequent years. "So Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise?" opens the bluntly named How Do You Sleep, a tune from John's September 1971 album Imagine, in response to this. "You may as well look directly into that mother's eyes. Whoever stated you were dead was absolutely correct." John composed the tune following Paul's triumph in the High Court. Paul wrote Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but he clearly didn't like it. In the lyrics, he seemed to be alluding to the conspiracy notion that Paul died in 1966, the year before the album was released to rave reviews. It continues with, "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day." In 1965, Paul co-wrote and released Yesterday by the Beatles. In February 1971, Paul released Another Day as a solo tune,